What is the fundamental driving force behind Trump's frequent about turns? It's the US Treasury bonds. However, I've noticed that many people don't take this issue seriously and think that the problem of US Treasury bonds isn't a big deal. I can tell you bluntly that if you can't understand the US Treasury bonds, you won't be able to make sense of the series of puzzling actions Trump has taken since he took office. The US national debt has now reached an astonishing $36 trillion. The annual interest payment is nearly $1.7 trillion. If this trend continues, the United States can't afford it, because the current amount of $1.7 trillion is more than twice the annual expenditure of the entire US military. So for Trump, at this moment, issues like the China-US game, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the Middle East situation are not the top priority matters to deal with. Now, all his energy must be focused on the urgent task of defusing this ticking time bomb of the US Treasury bonds. The first thing Trump has to solve is how to control the scale of the US Treasury bonds and prevent the US debt from exploding during his tenure. Otherwise, Trump will become a historical sinner of the United States. Once you understand this logic, you will realize that solving the US debt crisis is now the top most priority in Trump's work, and everything else can take a back seat. Other matters are just secondary. Why did Trump artificially create a small-scale financial crisis? In fact, it was to force the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, because a rate cut can lower the yield of US Treasury bonds, allowing Trump to pay less interest. For example, at the current interest rate of 4.5%, Trump needs to pay $1.7 trillion in interest. But if the Federal Reserve can cut the interest rate to 2.5%, Trump only needs to pay a few $100 billion in interest each year. It's equivalent to directly reducing his annual debt pressure by half. However, the Federal Reserve simply ignores Trump, because the Federal Reserve is not a national central bank controlled by the US government, but a privately controlled interest consortium. In fact, its actual controllers are the major commercial banks in the United States. The Federal Reserve Chairman doesn't need to be accountable to Trump. Instead, he needs to be accountable to the shareholders. Since the path of cutting interest rates didn't work, then how about cutting expenses? So Trump ordered Musk to carry out anti-corruption and staff reduction measures. The aim was to reduce government spending and relieve the government's financial pressure. Does Trump know that this will make him unpopular? Yes, he does, but he has no choice. If this money can't be saved, Trump won't be able to do anything. Then why did Trump attempt to annex Greenland? Claims like China and Russia using the Arctic shipping route are just excuses. The real purpose is that Trump has his eyes on the rare earth mines in Greenland, but he's just daydreaming. So what if he takes over Greenland? 90% of the global rare earth processing capacity is in China. Even if you mine the rare earths, don't you still have to transport them to China for smelting? Can you build a huge smelting system in the United States? As for the ports, needless to say, it's about controlling the world's key waterways. The purpose is to block the backdoor through which Chinese goods enter the United States via other countries when the trade war breaks out. When we understand all these things and then look at the magical trade war, can we see clearly what Trump's true intentions are? Statements like completely decoupling from China and bringing back manufacturing are all just for show, satisfying the emotional needs of some people. Since launching the trade war, Trump has publicly stated to the media on many occasions that he has been waiting for a call from China. What kind of call? A call for China to save the US Treasury bonds. In 2008, when the US suffered a subprime mortgage crisis and its economy was on the verge of collapse, then US Treasury Secretary Paulson came to China in person to ask for help. He hoped that China would buy US Treasury bonds to help the US get through the crisis. At that time, the relationship between China and the United States was very good, and China provided assistance. However, China had to issue 4 trillion yuan at home to counter the crisis caused by the US interest rate cut and help the US economy land smoothly. But at the same time, it also left a bubble risk in our domestic market. Now the US economy is once again on the verge of collapse, and an economic crisis is about to strike again. Trump wants China to help shoulder their debt once more. Can China help? With China's current strength, it can definitely do so. As I said in yesterday's program about the US Treasury Secretary, if Trump had first talked about the US Treasury bonds, saying that if China doesn't buy US Treasury bonds, he would impose tariffs. Would China buy them to protect its market? Yes, it would. Of course, this would require issuing a certain amount of money at home. But Trump made a big mistake. He got the order wrong. He first imposed tariffs and then talked about the US Treasury bonds, saying that for every certain amount of US Treasury bonds China buys, he would reduce the tariffs by a certain percentage. For China, this is nothing but extortion. No way. China itself is facing an economic crisis. Why should it issue at least 20 trillion yuan of debt for the United States? So why did Trump think that China would yield to his actions at that time? The reason is that he thought China's domestic demand was sluggish and its economy was highly dependent on foreign trade revenue. Once he threatened China with the decoupling of China and the United States, China would surely yield and definitely buy some US Treasury bonds or agree to buy new bonds to replace old ones. In plain terms, he wanted China to share part of the debt for the United States. Why did Trump give other countries a 90-day grace period? The fundamental reason is that in June, $6 trillion of US Treasury bonds in the United States are due. When the old debts mature, who will buy the new bonds? If the whole world refuses to buy, the United States will face a liquidity crisis, and the US dollar might even collapse. So, in essence, Trump is telling all countries, I'm giving you 3 months to prepare. Hurry up and buy US Treasury bonds. If you don't, I'll sanction you in July and make it impossible for you to survive. China clearly understands what Trump means. So, it's like, you can impose tariffs if you want. It doesn't matter much to us. Anyway, it's the off-season now, and not much goods can be sold. We can talk again after you sell this batch of debt to some other sucker. What is Trump actually afraid of? The answer can be seen from the rise in the yield of US Treasury bonds a few days ago. He is extremely worried that China will sell off all its US Treasury bonds at this juncture. If China clears its holdings of US Treasury bonds at this critical moment, it might trigger a US debt crisis. As I said a few days ago, Trump made the whole world aware of how crucial US Treasury bonds are within a week. At this time, if China sells off all its US Treasury bonds overnight, Japan, the EU, other countries, and even some retail investors might follow suit and sell. Then, no one will be interested in US Treasury bonds, and the US dollar hegemony will completely collapse. However, I believe that China will not do that for the time being. After all, crushing the United States won't do China any good. After all, we still need to do business in the future. If the United States has no money, who will buy Chinese goods? So, currently, China is practicing reverse decoupling. Now that there is a so-called quasi-decoupling, China has no demand for US dollars anymore and doesn't need to buy US Treasury bonds. China has valid reasons for this, but Trump really needs China to buy US Treasury bonds. So, he doesn't dare to push things to the extreme. If China really refuses to take over the debt, it will be a disaster for the United States. That's why he keeps calling on China to call him, but China just won't. Now, not only China dares not buy US Treasury bonds, but also the EU and Japan dare not. I have mentioned the Mar-a-Lago agreement several times. If the Mar-a-Lago agreement is really implemented, who would dare to buy US Treasury bonds? What if there is really a new Plaza Accord with 100-year ultra-long-term Treasury bonds that have zero interest and are non-tradable? This is even more serious than robbery. For all countries, when doing business with the United States, they just want to make some money. If the United States imposes tariffs, they can earn less, or if the tariffs are too high, they can simply stop doing business. But with Trump's current actions, when doing business with the United States, countries have to put their on the line. No one would want to do that. It's better to have nothing to do with each other from now on. Many problems can find some answers in history. In the 1990s, Japan was the world's #1 industrial power, and it was said that it could buy Manhattan. Then, the United States launched a trade war against Japan, and finally, the Plaza Accord was signed. At that time, the Japanese government thought its industrial foundation was very strong. Companies like Toshiba, Sharp, Sanyo, Panasonic, Mitsubishi, Honda, and Toyota were all quite profitable. A 10% currency appreciation didn't seem like a big deal, and Japan also boasted of being an industrial Cthulhu that was irreplaceable. In 1993, Japan's industry accounted for 23.8% of the global total output value. At that time, large cargo ships, tower cranes, industrial machinery, and precision machine tools were all produced in Japan. But due to the 10% appreciation of the Japanese currency and the Japanese authorities' policy of breaking through difficulties and taking short-term pain for long-term gain to burst the domestic bubble, the result is obvious. Japan has experienced 30 years of hardship. Can China be compared with Japan now? No, Chinese people don't have much money now, and there is no perfect social security system in China. If a Chinese version of the Plaza Accord is really signed, it could lead to serious consequences. So, that's why I support the Chinese government in standing up to Trump. Trump is basically trying to raid China. If you fight back with a pitchfork, maybe after he takes away your rice and white flour, there will still be some corn and sorghum left at home. But if you don't resist, he will take everything in your house. What do you think will be left in the end? Do you think your wife and children won't starve to death? Let me put it this way. Let's see what will happen to Vietnam, Taiwan, China, and Japan in the end. How much US Treasury bonds will they increase their holdings of? That's the money earned by Vietnamese people by making clothes one by one, by Japanese workers by screwing screws one by one, and by Taiwanese enterprises by earning money bit by bit. It's so heartbreaking to see this money being given to Trump for nothing. To sum up, standing up to Trump will be very painful, but surrendering will definitely not lead to a good outcome. Trump's trade war is essentially a form of financial blackmail. It's the United States using its US dollar hegemony to force other countries to share its debt risks. China's own debt is already reaching a critical point. How can it help the United States bear its debt? Stop talking about the so-called big customers. They are actually debt collectors. If the relationship breaks down, China won't make money, and if it doesn't, China will be burdened with debt. If you were the Chinese government, what choice would you make at this time?